Hello and welcome to Newsline. I'm Indiana Hansen.
And I'm James Kleeman. Today on the program, we'll see how businesses have been affected by the pandemic, how the in-person retail industry has suffered, media accountability in the modern era, and employee shortages in hospitality.
And we'll also have updates across sport, finance and weather. But first to today's breaking news. Melbourne's COVID-19 outbreak has grown, with Victoria recording 6 new locally acquired cases. This brings the total number of active cases in the state to 23. All cases are connected to the City of Whittlesea cluster. There is a total of 52 COVID sites. The acting Premier, James Merlino, has identified the next 24 hours as crucial and says he can't rule out further action. The Herald Sun has reported that authorities are currently in emergency talks over a potential 5-day lockdown.
Victorian MPs are reportedly considering staying in Canberra for the weekend. Western Australia has announced new border restrictions with Victoria in response to the latest Melbourne COVID-19 outbreak. Premier Mark McGowan says all arrivals from Victoria must be tested within 48 hours and self-quarantine until they return a negative result. Mr. McGowan warned that stricter border controls remain a possibility, saying the situation in Victoria was very concerning.
Victoria will become the first state in Australia to introduce an electric vehicle tax. The controversial legislation passed without amendment in the upper house last night. This means electric vehicle drivers will pay 2.5 cents for every kilometre travelled from the 1st of July. The Victorian Greens opposed the bill, but it passed 19 votes to 14.
Melbourne City Council has voted in favour of a safe injection room in the CBD. Lord Mayor Sally Capp and Deputy Lord Mayor Nicholas Rees backed the proposal, despite several councillors voting against it. It will be the second supervised injecting room in Melbourne after the Richmond Centre.
Power is being restored to most of Queensland after fire and explosion at the Collide Power Station left a majority of the state in the dark. An investigation has been launched into the catastrophic failure which triggered mass power outage from the New South Wales border to north of Cairns. Plant operator CS Energy says the exact cause of the fire and explosion is not yet known.
An investigation into whether anyone in Scott Morrison's office backgrounded against Brittany Higgins' partner has been completed. The investigation by Chief of Staff John Kunkel found no first-hand evidence of the Prime Minister's media team conducting a negative briefing. Higgins' partner David Shiraz has responded to the report, saying they won't be silenced.
A total lunar eclipse coinciding with the supermoon will be visible in Australian skies tonight for the first time in 3 years. At 7:44 p.m, the Earth's shadow will start to cross the moon's surface. The entire surface should be in shadow by 9:11 p.m, turning the moon from a ghostly white to a light red, which should last about 15 minutes. And those are the latest news headlines.
Now to our first story. And please note, this package was produced before the latest Melbourne outbreak. With COVID under control across the state and with the JobKeeper program ending in March, Victorian small businesses are welcoming back customers. Liam Webster McAllister reports.
After a disastrous 2020, small businesses are back open.
Good afternoon, Maria Hairstylist.
Melbourne's northern suburb of Preston is well known for its vibrant market that thrives on weekends when the local community gets out to shop. However, away from the busy foot traffic are small, humble businesses like Maria's Hairstylist, which has been a mainstay of the area for almost 5 decades. Maria's passion for her job shines through in her jovial personality and quality work, which is what keeps customers coming back after all these years.
I got a lady, my first client, that I've been doing her hair for 57 years, and she comes from the other side of the town. And she comes to me every week.
Maria's business was just one of those that suffered through COVID. Business expert Dr. Greg Chapman explained the difficulty many businesses experienced.
Face-to-face businesses were really the hardest hit. Things like hospitality, tourism, entertainment, even residential trades, because for a time there you couldn't get, say, a plumber to come to your house.
For many owners, their business isn't just about making a living.
I love my job. I love what I'm doing, and that's what you have to become a hairdresser. You have to love your job. because otherwise got a lot of challenges, like any other jobs here.
Maria's hairstylist has been a staple of the Preston community for 50 years, and like most other small businesses, was hit hard during the coronavirus. So it's important that local communities get out to support these businesses before it is too late. Liam Webster McAllister, Newsline.
We're heading to a short break now. Coming up, we'll be hearing about a decrease in foot traffic across Melbourne CBD stores. Stay with us.
Welcome back to Newsline. Lockdowns across Melbourne have largely ended, but many businesses are still feeling the effects. Ellen Madden has the story.
Despite Melbourne being out of lockdowns, the CBD hasn't returned to its usual state of hustle and bustle. Retail stores have been reporting a decrease in foot traffic. Retail worker Daniel Gardner has been observing the behavioural shift post-lockdown.
I don't think people have quite got used to their old way of life yet, and the full flow of things, getting into the city and just kind of living. The trade definitely is down from what it was. Mostly it's because we haven't had the full percentage of office workers back yet, and I think some office workers are still kind of divvying up their time between home and office, so we're feeling that, we're missing all our international trade. So that's a big chunk of people that we're usually in Melbourne, and they're not.
Fashion boutique The Bronze Snake have experienced a shift to online shopping following the closure of their stores in lockdown.
I feel like people are just buying stuff online to make it a bit easy for them not to come into the city or shops they normally used to go to. People are not travelling anymore, make it a little bit hard as well, not come through, but I just feel like some people might be a bit scared coming in, but then some people are pretty over it and happy to come in.
The lack of international, domestic and regional travellers have all impacted the number of customers coming in to shop in Melbourne CBD. With Melbourne being a hotspot for coronavirus in 2020, it seems many regional travellers are hesitant to take the commute into Melbourne.
People are avoiding kind of the cluster, a density. If we don't have all those people coming to work in the city, then Monday to Friday trade is going to be down everywhere, really. Cafes, retail, whatever.
Ellen Madden, Newsline.
And now we have Jeremy Garn joining us for international news. Today marks 1 year since George Floyd's murder. Jeremy, what is America doing today to remember him?
Yep, so President Joe Biden invited George Floyd's family to the White House for a closed-door meeting. Not only that, but Congress is currently weighing up a bill. Not only that, the George Floyd Memorial in Minneapolis has been the site of multiple tributes and vigils and even celebrations. And not only that, but marches all across the country and in many cities has been asking people to keep the fire going, to keep the movement alive.
What's been the worldwide impact of his death a year on?
Yeah, so his death has sparked, of course, as we all know, global protests in support of Black Lives Matters. Not only that, but here in Australia, the Black Lives Matter movement has brought Aboriginal deaths in police custody into the spotlight. Of course, today is National Sorry Day, so it's pretty self-evident.
Yeah. On to the Australian Kabul embassy. It's closing this Friday. Can you tell us more about the closing?
Yeah, so the Australian government is closing the embassy as part of an international effort to withdraw troops from Afghanistan. Now, mind you, this closing is just technically temporary. Before April, there was 1,500 troops in Afghanistan, but right now there's only 80 personnel present. Prime Minister Scott Morrison said the embassy will reopen when the country is safe.
I see. So what problems does the closing bring exactly?
Yeah. So a war crime investigator has said that the closing is not ideal for the investigations into war crimes perpetrated by the ADF. Not only that, but there's also fear that a lot of local contractors which worked for the embassy, such as security and translation, might be attacked by the Taliban. Not only that, but that problem is an ongoing problem with many defense forces and media teams traveling in the Middle East.
Lastly, to Samoa, Prime Minister Fiame Mataafa has been elected last month, but she's been locked out of Parliament. Yep. Why is this happening?
Yeah, so the incumbent president has refused to allow the president-elect access to the Parliament to let her party give oath for their seats. Not only that, but the incumbent president has been in power for 22 years and is absolutely strong on not conceding and absolutely strong on not recognizing Fiame's win.
What's been the international response to the power struggle?
Yeah, so the Federated States of Micronesia is the first country to recognize Fiame's win. And not only that, Micronesia has been urging many other countries to follow suit in their recognition, particularly calling out Australia and New Zealand to follow through. But many world leaders has absolutely refused to take a side.
Thanks, Jeremy.
The media's core role is to hold the powerful to account, but it's worth asking who holds the media to account and how that system functions. Daniel Cook has more.
Calls are growing to reform Australia's media regulation framework, following the media union's decision to withdraw from the Australian Press Council. The Press Council, which regulates print and their online counterparts, has been the target of criticism among media experts.
It's fragmented, it's weak, and it's got no public visibility.
Dr. Muller says the regulatory framework in Australia needs to be overhauled to amalgamate the current regulators, as well as deal with the power exercised by the global tech platforms.
I think myself the idea of a statute-based system, which is part funded by the industry, that's not just newspapers, but broadcast industry, by the global platforms and by government, independent of each of them and independent of government, audited for performance every year or two, is the only way forward, really.
In a statement at the time of the union's withdrawal, the Press Council said it was disappointed, but that it recognised that media regulation in Australia had to evolve. One La Trobe senior journalism lecturer agrees.
I definitely think that the stakeholders need to be younger journalists. I think they need to be, they need to involve people who are working in the media space now. Not, you have a lot of really sort of fogies. You've got dinosaurs behind a lot of these bodies.
Nassia Baffin says the current regulation framework needs to consider change in the industry.
I think that what needs to happen is that the entire system probably needs to be overhauled. We need to give more powers to these organisations.
With the 10th anniversary of the landmark Finkelstein inquiry coming up later in the year, media regulation is a hot topic. Despite all of the debate, however, experts are clear that more work remains to be done. Daniel Cook, RMIT Newsline.
The MCG has been listed as a COVID-19 exposure site, threatening pauses to the AFL season. Reporter Nick Hughes joins us live from the MCG. Nick, what's the latest on the MCG case?
Well, James, we know that there was a positive COVID-19 case that attended the Collingwood versus Port Adelaide game here at the MCG on Sunday. He was seated in Zone 4 on Level 1 of the southern stand, which was at the Punt Road end of the stadium. Individuals that were also seated in that area between bays 1 and 16 have been contacted directly by the Department of Health with instructions to monitor their symptoms and to get tested if any symptoms do arise. There is also an investigation of CCTV footage underway to determine whether or not any other areas of the stadium might need to be added to that list of exposure sites.
And what's happening with the AFL games in Melbourne this weekend?
Well, it's all very unclear actually at the moment, James. Initially this morning, the Victorian Minister for Sport and Major Events, Martin Pakula, had said the games would go ahead with fans in the stadium, but just within the last hour, the AFL have confirmed what was in an initial report from SEN that all 10 Victorian AFL clubs have been asked to lock down their players for 7 days, bringing back the 4 reasons to leave home that we endured last year during Stage 4 restrictions. There were 4 games set to be played in Melbourne this weekend, 2 here at the MCG as well. And acting Premier of Victoria, James Merlino, had echoed Mr. Pakula as well and spoke of the extensive work that both the AFL and the MCC had done to be prepared for any outbreaks of this kind. But at the moment, with a 7-day lockdown, it does appear the games will go ahead. There is no mention of behind closed doors or anything like that. So it appears to be a bit of a wait and see at the moment.
And what else did James Merlino have to say this morning?
Yes, Acting Premier James Merlino spoke this morning and said that the next 24 hours will be critical in determining the speed that this cluster is travelling at. Obviously, we know it originated in Whittlesea. It's now up to 15 positive cases, and there are 23 active cases in the whole of Victoria at the moment. James Merlino refused to deny that there may be the need for any further action taken in terms of lockdown or restrictions that might come in the next few days. But the positive news is that the 15 positive cases at the moment all do appear to be close personal contacts of other cases. There don't appear to be as yet any casual close contacts that have tested positive. Health Minister Martin Foley also spoke and said that 301 primary contacts have been identified, with at the moment 80 of those testing negative to the virus. But the key message was from Acting Premier, from the Health Minister, was to get vaccinated for any eligible Australians to come forward and get the jab as soon as they can. And Acting Premier Merlino also added what he spoke about yesterday and reiterated today, that the government is working to extend the list of eligible groups of people to get the vaccination. And he said updates on that front will come in the next couple of days.
Thanks to our reporter at the MCG, Nick Hughes.
Next up, how hospitality is suffering from an employee shortage. More after the break. Welcome back to Newsline. I'm Indiana Hanson. The hospitality industry has always been home to a large number of Australia's international workers, but the COVID-19 pandemic has forced the industry to try and survive without them. Bree Lancaster reports.
As Australia navigated its way through the COVID-19 pandemic in early 2020, many businesses, including restaurants and cafes, were forced to close. With no income and no way of knowing when they would be able to return to work, many workers within the hospitality industry were forced to return to their home countries. Now, more than 12 months since Victoria's first lockdown, the hospitality industry is trying to return to normal, but with our borders still closed to international workers, many businesses are struggling to find the number of staff they once had.
People are reducing their hours because they just don't have the team members to be able to open 5 days a week or five nights a week. So it's sort of like a lot of people are missing the opportunity as a result of how few people are left in the industry.
Restaurants are finding themselves busier than ever, but keeping up with the demand is getting increasingly more difficult with the lack of staff available. In a brief reprieve, the Australian government has announced a temporary relaxation to the number of hours those in the country on student visas are able to work. From the aged care sector to the hospitality and tourism industry, students are now able to work up to 40 hours per fortnight.
How many students are actually here? I think that's my main question. We're actively trying to find people at the moment. We just can't find anyone, let alone try and get them to work 40 hours. So if you have a student visa holder who's working for you, then that's amazing. But if you haven't already got one, then I don't really think it solves many issues.
Bree Lancaster, Newsline.
A lot has been made of Australia's housing market recently, and in Melbourne, it's no different, with the median house prices reaching $1 million. But recent data suggests that first home buyers are turning to their parents more and more to help with their deposits in a bid to enter the market. Jack Alfonso reports.
Housing prices in Melbourne are skyrocketing, and in Northcote, Thornbury and Preston, it's no different. With median prices doubling over the past 10 years, local residents and prospective homeowners are feeling wary.
I wouldn't feel that secure about getting a home loan for something in this area. I'm a bit worried that potentially the housing bubble will burst a little bit.
And for residents such as Sam, who are already local to the area, the challenge seems to be getting harder.
Would be very interested into moving in this area. I really like the area as far as what it has going on. Whether that's viable for myself or not, I'm not sure, but I am looking currently, yeah.
Moving from renting to owning is proving more difficult due to escalating prices. And, according to research, over 60% of first home buyers are relying on their loans from their parents to enter the market, with analysts suggesting the move is ill-advised.
Those first-time buyers have a 3 times greater probability of falling into default than those who've gone the long, slow route of saving.
Getting a home loan from their parents isn't an option that is readily available for everyone, however. And, as median house prices continue to escalate at a rate faster than real wage growth, entering the housing market for first home buyers continues to become an ever more daunting prospect. Government policies such as withdrawing super and low interest rates aren't doing much to counter this either, with Martin suggesting all policy seems to be directed toward boosting the construction sector.
I don't actually subscribe at all to these particular schemes being positive for anyone. It doesn't really solve any long-term housing affordability issues, and it doesn't necessarily make it easier for people to get into the market.
For the residents in Melbourne's north, though, the bubble continues to grow as owning a house becomes more dream than reality. Jack Alfonso, Newsline.
Today marks the 23rd National Sorry Day since the Bringing Them Home report from 1997. We're joined again by Jack Alfonso from the RMIT Media Precinct to talk about its history and significance. So Jack, what does National Sorry Day represent?
Yeah, so today is the 26th of May, and it commemorates the first National Sorry Day that was held in 1998, which was a direct outcome of the Bringing Them Home report that was tabled in 1997. So National Sorry Day essentially acknowledges the government policies that resulted in the attempted assimilation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders children from their families into white Australian families. Now, we know that these events occurred from the mid-19th century all the way through to the 1970s. And essentially, it is estimated between 1 in 10 children were forcibly removed from their homes.
And you mentioned the Bringing Them Home report. What does it and what did it find, and what actions have resulted from it?
Yeah, so as mentioned before, the Bring Them Home report was tabled in 1997, and the report, it was the result of an inquiry conducted by what is now currently known as the Australian Human Rights Commission. And the initial report itself was titled The National Inquiry into the Separation of Australian and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Children from their families. So the conclusion that was drawn from this report essentially was that the acting governments had committed a violation of human rights. It also found 54 recommendations, and some of the key ones were a national apology, reparations, improved services for the stolen generations, and processes for monitoring the implementation of these recommendations.
And Reconciliation Week starts tomorrow. How can people get involved?
Yeah, so Reconciliation Week is bookmarked by a couple of key events for the Aboriginal community. They reference the 1967 referendum and also the June 3rd, 1992 High Court decision from the High Court of Australia. And the overarching theme for National Reconciliation Week revolves around us all being in this together, and it focuses on the positive relations and that are facilitated by truth-telling, and also some uncomfortable conversations that are undertaken between Aboriginal people and white Australia. There are a number of events taking place across Australia, and anyone who's more keen to get involved with these events should refer to the Reconciliation Australia website.
Thanks, Jack.
We're now heading to a short break. Coming up next, we have the Roundup with Jordan Zock and Shannon Green. Stay with us. Good afternoon and welcome to the Roundup. I'm Jordan Zock.
And I'm Shannon Green. In the Roundup, we're going to be looking at some of the biggest stories across arts, tech, and in the papers. But first, let's take a look at today's headlines across the globe.
The New York Times homepage features multiple stories remembering the life of George Floyd, 1 year after he was murdered by an American police officer. US President Joe Biden met with the members of the Floyd family after a demonstration march in downtown Los Angeles. The president spoke about his hope for the future and reflected on the current state of the US and police reform.
The front page of the Indian national daily, The Hindu, features discussions between India and US government officials about ramping up the global distributions of COVID vaccines. The paper also covers a World Trade Organization initiative to waive intellectual property protections for COVID-19 vaccines.
In Europe, the Daily Austrian News is reporting that the country's Ministry of Health are banning flights from the United Kingdom starting on the 1st of June in response to the spreading Indian variant of COVID-19 in the UK. The ban will prevent any non-Austrian citizens and residents from entering the country, with some exceptions. Canadian publication The Globe and Mail are featuring a story about the growing number of young adults who are financially supporting their parents. The story highlights the growing trend of financial support that is particularly prevalent in immigrant families.
And today in South China Morning Post, a report of Chinese fishing vessels entering the waters bordering South and North Korea has reignited a long-standing maritime dispute. South Korean authorities say that the boats are sweeping up everything in their path while leaving a trail of environmental destruction behind them. And that's it for today's front page world news. Now over to tech news. In China, AI emotion detection software is reportedly being used. We're joined now by our tech reporter, Bridget Murphy. Bridget, what exactly is this software being used for?
Well, the BBC is reporting that the software is being used on Uyghurs. Roughly 12 million Uyghurs live in Xinjiang, made up mostly of Muslims. Multiple human rights groups have accused China of detaining more than 1 million Uyghurs over the past few years in what the state calls re-education camps. AI and facial recognition intends to reveal the states of emotion in those monitored. The BBC's Panorama program spoke with a software engineer who claims to have installed such systems in police stations in the province.
There's been reports now for many months that the Uyghurs and the Xinjiang are under daily surveillance. Do we know exactly why this technology is now being used?
It's hard to know exactly why it's being used and what it's being used for. The software engineer the BBC spoke to says it's being used like a lie detector test, but with far more advanced technology. He says the system is trained to detect and analyse minute changes in the face and even changes in skin pores. Human rights activists have condemned the use of this technology, but Beijing has justified the use of surveillance, saying it needs to keep an eye on separatists in the region, claiming they are responsible for deadly terror attacks.
To our next story, a Russian court has fined Google and Facebook after it found the organizations failed to remove content Moscow had deemed illegal. Bridget, can you tell us more?
So this is the latest development in an escalating standoff between Russia and tech giants. Russia has been monitoring tech to check that organizations have been adhering to calls to delete banned content. So Russia's media watchdog said it gave Google 24 hours to delete videos that contain drugs, violence, and extremism. The court then stepped in and said it fined them after they failed to delete that content. Some of the content included posts that encouraged minors to join unsanctioned protests earlier this year in January, when Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny was detained.
Companies like Google and Facebook have billions of dollars in revenue. How much have they been fined, and would this even have an impact on them?
Well, a number of organisations have reported Google was fined roughly between 4 and 6 million rubles, which roughly evens out to around 70,000 to 100,000 Australian dollars. Considering Google is worth roughly around $420 billion and Facebook $528 billion, one has to wonder if this is much of a deterrence for tech giants.
And is this the first time this has happened to a big tech company?
No, this isn't the first time, especially with Russia. Russia has clamped down on big tech, with social media network Twitter being manually slowed for users earlier this month for also not deleting banned content.
Thanks, Bridget. Now we'll look at the arts.
Vivid Sydney has announced their 2021 lineup. Like so many other festivals last year, it had to be cancelled due to COVID-19. Arts reporter Georgie Carroll joins us now. Georgie, what can we expect to see at this year's Vivid Festival?
So this year's festival will feature an all-Australian lineup with some of the biggest acts in the country taking the stage. There'll be a debut new show from Stanford the Great, a 5-night residency from King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, and a solo piano show from Angie McMahon, just to name a few.
Vivid is known for their colourful projections and installations. Apart from the music, what other things can we expect from the festival this year?
So this year there will be several art installations, including a 4-metre tall flower display. There will also be a conversation about the healing powers of the arts from Magda Swiansky, just to name a few of the things happening other than music.
On to our next story. American actor Timothée Chalamet has been announced to play Willy Wonka in the new spin-off of the classic Roald Dahl book. What can you tell us about this, Georgie?
So yes, today, Warner Brothers announced that the 25-year-old Oscar-nominated actor will be following in the footsteps of Gene Wilder and Johnny Depp in a new adaptation of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory.
As you've already mentioned, it's certainly not the first time this movie has been remade. What do you think was behind the decision of Warner Brothers?
So yeah, it was definitely an interesting move from Warner Brothers to do another adaptation of such a classic story. It's definitely a trend that we're seeing at the moment with lots of remakes, reboots and rewriting of old stories. So we asked the public what they think of a reboot of a classic story.
DC movies are constant reboots and I don't care.
Gene Wilder and Johnny Depp have also done it. Can you tell us what we should expect from this different Wonka?
So this will be a musical adaptation based on the early life of Wonka. The plot details are very much under wraps at the moment, but we'll be exploring the upbringing of Wonka and will feature Timothy singing and dancing. The director, Paul King, recently directed Paddington and Paddington 2.
Thank you, Georgie. Now a look at today's political cartoons.
We are joined by our reporter, Carolyn Killeen. To our first story now. A cartoon from The Age is looking at the COVID restrictions implemented in Victoria last night. What does this cartoon suggest about the effectiveness of these restrictions?
So Melbourne's new restrictions were implemented last night in response to the COVID outbreak in Melbourne's north. For those in the Greater Melbourne region, masks will be required inside and outdoors when unable to socially distance. The cartoon highlights the contradictory nature of Victoria's recent restrictions, particularly because the vaccination rollout has seen large gatherings of people every day. So it's insinuating that limiting public gatherings to 30 people is futile in the scheme of things. At this stage, vaccination hubs will continue to host large gatherings of people, and there is yet to be any change to the density requirements at cafes, restaurants, nightclubs or venues, which is why there's definitely frustration amongst the public and a lack of trust in how effective these will be in stopping the spread of COVID.
Moving on to the American newspaper US Today, they've got a cartoon looking at the Israel and Palestinian conflict. Carolyn, can you tell us more about that?
Yep, so the illustration is of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. The book he's holding is titled Wag the Dog, which is an idiom that refers to the act of creating diversion from a detrimental issue. It's suggesting that the Israeli government is diverting public attention from their alleged war crimes and human rights abuses against Palestinians. Netanyahu has maintained that Israel has been compliant with international law despite global criticism and pressure from the United Nations and the International Criminal Court, including various alleged war crime investigations. It's also definitely suggesting that Netanyahu's main interest in all of this is to be re-elected.
And the next cartoon is from the online publication US News and World Report. Caroline, could you take us through it?
Yeah, so yesterday was the first anniversary of George Floyd's murder.
The circumstances of his death amplified discussions surrounding police brutality and systemic racism. It also gave significant momentum to the Black Lives Matter movement. The cartoon depicts a common conservative response of criticism of the police and represents the thinking of the Blue Lives Matter movement, which was or still is a counter to the Black Lives Matter movement. One of their key messages is that not all cops are bad, quite similar to the conservative approach to criticism of the patriarchy, that not all men are bad. Yeah.
Thanks, Caroline. That's our roundup for today. Thank you to our other reporters, Bridget Murphy and Georgie Carroll. For the roundup, I'm Jordan Zock.
And I'm Shannon Green. We're going to take a short break now, and then we'll be back with sport, weather and finance.
Welcome back to Newsline. Just some quick breaking news. South Australia will close its border to Greater Melbourne from 6 p.m. tonight. Now to some news on the state budget.
The state budget has provided $5.3 billion towards the construction of 12,000 new homes and to support 10,000 new jobs. But is this enough? Professor Wendy Stone joins me from the Swinburne University of Technology. Good afternoon, Professor Stone. Thanks for your time.
Good afternoon. Hello.
Victoria's state budget proposed Australia's biggest investment in public and community housing. Is this enough housing to fill the backlog and the demand that is needed?
Oh, look, this is a really remarkable step forward in the right direction. It's one of the biggest announcements we've had in Australia around social housing for a very, very long time. So it's extremely significant. It's extremely positive. But we know that the waiting list, the need for supported housing is actually greater than this. And so this really is a genuinely good step in the right direction, particularly as the program builds in jobs, regional development, and some really targeted programs for particular population groups, including First Nations people, for example. But in the short term, we might need to additionally look at some, I guess, creative options, if you like, around how we can actually boost the amount of social housing and quite supported housing right now.
And in terms of who is targeted by this funding and who is benefiting, what kind of action or policy would you like to see put in place to further support people to get back on their feet?
Yeah, well, this really is a central plank in that picture. So the social housing big build is absolutely critical. Additionally, what we might like to see and need to see is a bit of partnering between the state government, some not-for-profits, and maybe some private sector property management. We know, for example, that as people have left Melbourne through the lockdown and through opportunities to work from home, there's actually quite a vacancy within the middle of the city and some reduced rents. So opportunity schemes like looking at, for example, the way that government could head lease those apartments and those smaller dwellings, for example, and actually let them out to people on that eligibility waiting list to really get in and make a short-term solution, as well as these longer-term, really important big build projects would be really welcome.
And 25% of funding is set to be allocated to regional Victoria. Do you think Victorians in regional areas will feel the benefit of this in a similar way to those in the city?
Yeah, look, the regions, as we know, we're reading about it almost every day now, are really struggling just with the influx of people who've moved away from Melbourne and other major areas in Australia to the regional areas because of this opportunity to do so. It's also, I guess there's a sort of a perfect storm in the regional areas right now where people are moving from the city to the regions. At the same time, we're taking some of the housing stock right out of regional towns and putting it into things like short lets, so Airbnb and so on. We all love this, but potentially, you know, we've had too much of a good thing right now where we are seeing an increase in those short lets hitting the market. Every time that happens, it really means that you know, there's another dwelling taken out of the housing system. So thinking about how to increase supply in the regions, how to increase education and training and employment opportunities in a sustainable way and respond to this this rapid need for new infrastructure is really important. It's a very critical part of this government's proposal.
Professor Wendy Stone, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
Now it's time for sport, with reporter Lauren Bastow joining us for the latest updates.
Lauren, there was an interesting decision that came out last night at the tribunal. What happened?
Yes, the AFL Tribunal has overturned the controversial 2-game suspension handed to Gold Coast's Nick Holman for a rundown tackle in round 10. Holman was awarded a free kick for the tackle on Mitch Duncan, but received a suspension for rough conduct from the match review officer after the game. Last night, the tribunal found the momentum of the pair was to blame for the concussion suffered by Duncan, in a result that took 30 minutes to come to. Also in the AFL, sports journalist Mick Warner has released his book titled The Boys Club today. The book is a self-described expose covering scandals and politics of the AFL in recent decades. The Australian Olympic Committee have announced the women's squad for this year's Tokyo Olympics. Liz Cambridge and co-captain alongside Jenna O'Hee weeks after Cambridge threatened to boycott the Games. And lastly, the A-League and the W-League have reached a new 5-year media deal. Channel 10 and new streaming service Paramount Plus will share the broadcasting of upcoming seasons. That's all for sport. Back to you, Indiana and James.
As bars and clubs across Melbourne welcome patrons after multiple lockdowns last year, people are meeting face-to-face once again. Tyler Wright went to a speed dating event in the CBD to find out how people feel about dating during the pandemic.
dating can be hard at the best of times, let alone during a global pandemic. This is where people like Darcy Todd come in.
I've started Melbourne Social Events, so basically we run events at Melbourne pubs and clubs across Melbourne.
Moving out of lockdown, he noticed a gap in the market for singles meetups, so he branched out his services to accommodate.
During that lockdown, there wasn't really any speed dating events. So I actually just did one, like, right, we'll give it a crack, and it just filled up.
It's been nice to meet new people because through the pandemic, we're very isolated from a rural area, so it's, yeah, I don't get to see anyone for a lot of it.
You just don't find success on there, and even if you do, it's only like, one night stands or friends with benefits.
Yeah, one bad date after the other.
So for the moment, social interaction seems to be the goal.
Really nice people. Not sure if any of them go anywhere, but definitely people I can be friends with.
And while some are keen to keep venturing into the dating scene,
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I do it.
others are just happy playing Cupid.
This guy was like, oh, this chick's a total dork. And I was like, oh, that's a bit mean. And she wrote the same thing about him. This guy's a dork. And then they both took yes on each other. So I thought that was pretty cute.
Speed dating isn't new, but in a city coming out of lengthy lockdowns, it may take on a different role. Tyler Wright, Newsline.
And now to finance with Stephen Yuen. Stephen, tell us what's going on with the markets today.
Thanks, James. In the Australian market, the ASX 200 is up 0.1%, but has stayed at 799 points. Today's best performing stocks are Afterpay and Hub24, both gaining more than 2%. The Dow Jones fell by 0.24%, Nikkei increased by 0.093%, and Nasdaq decreased by 0.029%. One Australian dollar has remained steady, buying 77 US cents, $1 and 7 New Zealand dollars, 63 euro cents, 54 pence, or 84 yen. In today's financial news, the Wall Street Journal reported last night that the Chinese yuan risen to its highest value. This comes as no surprise as China has made a quick recovery from COVID-19, which has led to a surge of international investments into Chinese markets. Onto commodities. The price of gold has been a steady rise again, but currently sits at $1,899 an ounce. Silver is also increasing by 0.047% and is $28 an ounce. Brent crude oil has decreased by 0.03%, while Western Texas Intermediate also decreased by 0.02%. That's finance.
Thanks, Stephen. Now to weather from Melbourne, around the country, and with reporter Marianne Gray.
Thanks, James. Today it is a cloudy and a windy morning in Melbourne, with a high chance of rain in the southeast suburbs. Top of 15 degrees, low of 11. To the capital cities around Australia for tomorrow, a 90% chance of rain in Melbourne, reaching 15 degrees. In Sydney, 20% chance of rain with a top of 19. Mostly sunny in Brisbane tomorrow at a top of 19 also. Adelaide, 30% chance of rain at a top of 18 degrees. Mostly sunny in Perth. 5% chance of rain and a top of 24. Darwin, less humid and sunny with a 0% chance of rain and a top of 32. Hobart, an 80% chance of rain, top of 13, and in the nation's capital, Canberra faces a 0% chance of rain with a top of 15 degrees. Looking ahead, the rain is here to stay this week, all through to 2nd of June. 90% chance of rain tomorrow, 70% chance on Friday, 5% on Saturday. Sunday and Monday will be partly cloudy on both days, top of 14 degrees on Sunday and 16 on Monday. It will be a partly cloudy start to next week, with Tuesday set to hit at a top of 16 degrees with a 10% chance of rain. That's all for the Newsline weather. I'm Marion Gray. Back to you, Indiana James.
Now some final breaking news. The federal government has announced the release of 130,000 more AstraZeneca vaccine doses.
The doses will be available to Victorians over the next 6 weeks.
And that concludes Newsline for today. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm James Kleeman.
And I'm Indiana Hanson. Have a great week.